his remarks and welcome you to, on behalf of the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine. The center critically engages the intersection of social systems, social difference, health, and healthcare in the United States and across the globe. It brings together scholars and practitioners from throughout the Bay Area from such fields as anthropology, sociology, medicine, public health, history, working on questions related to medicine, the health sciences, public health, global health, and the social structuring of suffering, violence in the body. We promote research, interdisciplinary writing and publication, graduate and undergraduate training, as well as conferences like this one today. Our collaboration with the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues enables us to sponsor events and host graduate student fellows and postdoctoral fellows. So I'm the co-director. Seth Holmes is the other co-director. He is now in Germany this year. We're very pleased today to sponsor an event called Theory in Action, Violence in the Margins. And all my role only consists of introducing Jim Quesada, who is a graduate of the Joint PhD program in Medical Anthropology of UCSF in Berkeley, and is now professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology at San Francisco State University. He's a critical medical anthropologist with 18 years of experience doing ethnographic research in California, Nicaragua, and in the spaces of migration between Central America and California, focused on violence, social suffering, and structural vulnerability. Some of the populations and communities he has focused on primarily are undocumented Latino day laborers, agricultural workers, urban youth, sex workers, and injection drug users. His work has appeared in the Annual Review of Public Health, City and Society, Journal of Healthcare for the Poor, and Undeserved, and also in Medical Anthropology, and includes a wonderful essay, among many others, No Soy Welfarero, Latino Laborers in the Crosshairs of Legitimation Maneuvers. Thanks so much for coming.
All right, thank you. This is really an honor, and I'm pleased to be here, particularly to moderate as much as I can our wonderful guest here. Theory in Action, Violence in the Margins. The work by Javier and Philippe and Nancy are well known around issues of violence. And each of the speakers share a concern and a commitment to describing the suffering that violence produces and perpetuates. And particularly as it occurs in the urban margins of the Americas. And I'm pleased that we were thinking about the Americas as a block rather than distinguishing it and breaking it up into North America and Central and South America, but to problematize the whole idea of violence as it pervades everywhere. And then the whole notion of margins and how we begin to think about margins. And what's particularly important about this book is how it does problematize the whole notion of margins as something that is spatial, something that is social, political, economic. When we talk about margins spatially, we're actually talking about how the city marks zones of inclusion and exclusion, where people are segregated and corralled into spaces that can be surveilled, controlled, and regulated. Socially, when we talk about marginalization, we're talking about people who have been marginalized and stigmatized, regarded as disposable. Politically, when we talk about marginalization, we're talking about people who have been socially labeled as unworthy or undeserving, disenfranchised. And economically, we're talking about people that have been disenfranchised from the formal economy. So when we begin to think about marginalization, it's important to think about it as that kind of complex whole. The same obtains for thinking about violence and thinking about violence in terms of being a continuum. I mean, intuitively, we tend to think we know what violence is, usually, reduced to brute physical force, but in fact, it's important to think about violence more expansively, particularly when we are talking about people that have been marginalized. And to move beyond just a kind of simplistic, reductive way of thinking about violence, we need to think about violence, particularly in terms of being an outcome of marginalization. And when we think about it in terms of how the margins actually are sites where violence is produced, it's important to think also that the kind of violence we're talking about oftentimes appears as a, or is lived as a subterranean undercurrent that of insults and indignities that people are subject to. Another way to think about violence is in terms of structural violence, and what comes to mind are the isms, the sexisms, the racisms, the disableisms, and so on that are rampant, where we can't always be able to pinpoint specifically the perpetrators and agents of the violence that occurs, but nevertheless pervades. The other thing that I think is really important about this book, when we think about violence and we think about margins, is that all of a sudden, and what this book does so well, is to break apart the complex of violence and move away from simple binaries between good guys and bad guys, victims and perpetrators and so on. And in fact, what we see increasingly in our times is a proliferation and a mutation of the forms that violence takes. Proliferated in terms of its interpersonal character, its gendered character, the causalities, whether it's drug-related, gang-related, the collusion of the state, and local communal violence, all kinds. One of the things that is unfortunate and that we have thought about often is how the state has oftentimes been seen as a monopolizer of legitimate violence. But it no longer it monopolizes violence, because violence has broken into a multitude of forms that involves multiple actors, that is stratified and distributed among the most disadvantaged populations. Because at one level, violence has become a primary resource for everyday survival, and even it offers itself as a form of upward mobility for some. And so one of the things that Javier and Philippe and Nancy do so well, and the other contributors to this volume, is really to think about this kind of new urban violence in all its multiple forms, how it is fueled by limited job prospects and failing neighborhood institutions and high levels of segregation. And also to think about violence laterally, where violence has been directed by one vulnerable population against another, a sort of communal or collective manifestation of displaced aggression that gets played out. And so the multiple forms that violence has taken has created a conundrum of sorts, where it's not easy to simplify it to, as I mentioned before, good guys and bad guys. But in fact, victims become perpetrators that become victims, and this incredible, cyclical, ongoing conundrum of people finding themselves, contained in a dynamic of both being victimized and perpetrators, and how to break out of that is one of the things that this volume strives to look at. Not merely diagnose the problem of violence in the margins, but tries to get an understanding of how these cycles and complexities can be dealt with. And so I would like to turn it to Javier, and who actually is the primary person that put this volume together.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. While they work on this, I was really looking forward to this event until I got distracted a month ago with the fight that we're fighting against a law in the state of Texas that will allow guns inside classrooms, concealed guns, concealed at least. Sorry. So for the last month, I've been doing something completely different, and I went back, a day or so ago to put this presentation together. It's a little bit more disjointed than I would have liked.
This book is the product of a workshop that we organized at UT Austin a few years back, that its main idea was to sort of compare notes and try to make sense of what we all saw was a very puzzling development in the Americas. As most countries are moving away from authoritarian or dictatorial regimes, levels of crime and violence keep rising. Even more puzzling for me as a sociologist is that violence keep rising even when, at least in certain areas, levels of inequality are decreasing. So the book attempts to examine the causes, the forms, and responses to interpersonal violence. A violence that is mostly affecting those that are living at the bottom of the social symbolic order. A violence that is concentrating in slums and shantytowns in the Americas, in villas in Argentina, in favelas in Brazil, in comunas, in Colombia, in barrios, in Caracas, to the point of becoming what one of the contributors to our volume, Dennis Rogers, says it's a defining feature of life in such settlements at the beginning of the 21st century. Now, different from my two co-editors, and it's a confession, I still can't believe I'm co-editing a book with them, so it's like a dream come true. I came to the study of violence almost by chance and late. I was actually trying to replicate a study of environmental suffering that I conducted with Deborah Suistun, who is a native anthropologist, in a highly contaminated shantytown named Flammable in Argentina. And I wanted to know how contamination was experienced when its sources were not as visible as they were in Flammable, a neighborhood that sits adjacent to the second largest petrochemical compound in Argentina. Only a few weeks into our research, and this time I carried the research together with an elementary school teacher, the local school students began to bring us together with what we call toxic stories, open stories about open-air garbage dumps where they play, rats that were all over, potable water that tastes like oil. They began to bring us accounts of murders, of rapes, of shootings, of domestic fights. When we ask them to draw the things they like and the things they did not like about their neighborhood as good Argentines, they brought stories of soccer and, on the other hand, of people shooting at each other. When they talk among themselves, violence also shows up. Here I have a field note from my co-author, seated at the base of a flagpole. Recess has hardly begun. Samantha and Pedro, two of my fourth graders, chat lively. Pedro asks, and your dad, does he have a bullet scar? No, my dad's shots are old. Violence is also present when they articulate their fears, sort of the sounds of their fears, the sounds that scare them. This is another field note. Sixth grade students discuss a series of short stories about urban legends that includes ghosts, monsters, and other frightening creatures. So what are you afraid of? Fernanda asks the class. Usually reticent to speak up, the students grab the opportunity to talk about what really matters to them. The question sparks an hour-long conversation about the fears, and what they mention is footsteps on the roof, rats, gunshots, screams during robberies, clicks of a pistol trigger barrel, storms. And lastly, one of the students adds the cracking and explosive blast of fire because he says when cars are stolen, they burn them down and they explode. Interpersonal violence in the area where we did our fieldwork, on the basis of which we based our chapter for this book, is, to speak with Norbert Elias, an almost unavoidable and everyday events. In body counts, in shootings, in assaults, in robberies, it's stamped in the walls of the neighborhood, as in this graffiti here. I was born amid bullets. I was raised among thugs. It is in the murals, which offer a visual reminder of the lethal consequences of this violence. Here is 18-year-old Acho, who was killed by a local store owner. The same thing with a 19-year-old who was also murdered, Danny. So as a result of this initial and quite unexpected encounter with local viewpoints, we decided to shift the empirical focus from contamination to the dynamics and meanings of interpersonal violence in this highly marginalized area. Daily violence, we soon found out, is also present as the grievance at the root of incipient forms of collective action. This is a rally I attended on February 2013, where roughly 80 residents were gathered in front of the local police station to demand protection and police action against drug dealers. See? And this is a sign that this 8-year-old was carrying, that encapsulates, on the one hand, the fear and impotence that overwhelms local residents, and in more than a way animates our volume. The sign reads, "I'm growing up in a neighborhood full of drugs and criminals. What do I do?" And I think that question is, to a great extent, not only animates the volume. I'm still, confessions, searching for an answer for this kid. I don't know exactly what to tell him, what to do. I suspect the answer is in what he was doing in collective action. But overall, our volume seeks to show that violence is, as Jim just put it, or as Marcel Mauss would say, a total social fact. Relational activity that has indeed larger implications throughout society, but it is at once legal, political, economic, ethical, cultural, private, public, individual, and collective. And the overall aim of the book is to shed light and place under the ethnographic microscope all these different dimensions of violence. Now, I'm not going to describe all the chapters for you. You have to get the book and read it. But let me say a few words about how I see violence operating at the urban margins in Argentina in particular, but also elsewhere, as we learned from the contributors of the book. Ana Villarreal is another author of the book, who is right here. We should have introduced her. So 3 main points about what I see are central features of the dynamics and meanings of violence. First, much of the violence that takes place at the urban margins resembles that which has been dissected by students, say, of street violence in the United States. It is the product of interpersonal retaliation and remains encapsulated in dyadic exchanges. What someone would say, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. In this, the violence at the urban margins of Buenos Aires or Caracas resembles the one that pervades daily life in the most dangerous of inner cities, in Brazilian favelas, in Colombian comunas. But when we cast a wider net to include other forms of physical aggression, sexual violence, domestic violence, intimate violence, that take place inside and outside the home, and that do shape the course of residents' daily lives, we begin to see that violence is used for many diverse goals, and it takes many different forms. It does not just serve retaliatory purposes, and it does not stay within dyadic relationships. That's why we talk, and what we need to start talking, and what one of the difficulties I had as someone coming late to the study of violence, because I confronted a very compartmentalized, balkanized literature that talks about domestic violence, or family violence, or street violence, or drug violence, as if those violences, and I know it's not a word in English, I fought with my editor and it's not, as if those violence were separated. So let me give you one example from my own field note, and I'm sure Philippe and Nancy have plenty of those. Dealers barge into a home, point a gun at the face of a mother of an addict, and claim a drug payment. And when this same mother threatens to break the fingers of her addicted son, or actually furiously punches him, in order to prevent him from stealing things from her house, things like a small TV set that then he sells to finance his addiction, but that the TV set does not belong to his mother, but to her second husband, who enraged then beats her, the wife. And if you have trouble following me, it's because we are not confronted with discrete episodes of violence, but with concatenated violent exchanges. And I think we need to move beyond one-on-one retaliation, and part of the aim of this book is to move the conversation and to sort of blur or transcend these boundaries between very discrete forms of violence and start talking about relationally about violence. Along these same lines, as Jim was pointing out, we think that violence is indeed part of a routine way of dealing with everyday life issues inside and outside the home, a sort of repertoire of action that still needs to be dissected and studied. So, second argument, at the urban margins, and again to paraphrase Norbert Elias, everyday life is subjected to sudden reversals of fortune. In the face of this depacification, the political sociologist inside me needs to ask, what is the state doing? How does the state police or does not police poor people's disputes? How does it intervene at the urban margins? One of the things we're trying to do in this volume is move the conversation beyond descriptions of destitute urban areas in the Americas as either governance voids, deserted by the state, in which the state is nowhere to be found, or militarized spaces firmly controlled by the state's iron fist. As many of the contributors in the volume shows, the presence of the state is intermittent, is selective, and is contradictory, and the fractured presence of the state is in fact perpetuating the violence it is presumed to prevent. And we can think of, not just cases of police brutality, but also, police recruitment of youngsters to then commit various crimes, collusion with drug dealers, as Dennis Rogers clearly shows, etc., etc. So the third argument, being in harm's way, what do people do? This is the focus of my particular chapter, and it's the focus of Anna's chapter and Veronica Zubillaga's chapter. It's an entire section of what do people do. It's a sort of paraphrasing E.P. Thompson's Being Hungry, what do people do, right? And being in danger, in harm's way, what do people do? Now, residents of dangerous communities are very, very aware of the hazards that chronic exposure to violence poses, and they express a deep desire to protect their loved ones from harm, and they make active efforts to do so despite the many constraints they face. In these, residents of Buenos Aires resemble those in Caracas, in Monterrey, in Managua, in Bogota, in Rio de Janeiro. Now, however, while sociological and journalistic accounts of life in dangerous communities point to some of the most spectacular ways in which people respond to danger, such as direct retaliation, collective organizing, vigilantism, lynching, etc., we still know very little about these less public practices and routines that residents under siege devise to prevent violence and to protect their loved ones. And I think that's where our particular intervention in that section of the book lies. We point, for example, at very ordinary acts such as establishing and following nightly curfews, scheduling meals together, walking together to a bus stop, as potential antidotes to counteract the many unknowns which residents face at the urban margins. Now, along these sort of routines, there are other forms, strategies to cope with chronic violence. The same residents that organize group trips to a bus stop, introduce schedules to their families, teach their sons and daughters how to fight, or if they fear for their safety, tie up their sons and daughters to prevent them from doing drugs, or really beat them to prevent further harm. As Sonia once told me, a resident from Shantytown in Buenos Aires, I know how to defend myself. I learned how to kill when I was a little kid. My grandfather taught me. You know what you guys have here? She said, pointing out the Adam's apple. I know how to kill you just with my 3 fingers. And then in one of those ethnographic moments that sometimes you cherish and sometimes you think you'd rather be elsewhere, she grabbed an apple and she goes like, tack, this is how I learned. And we go like, so where was I? So when a grandfather teaches his granddaughter how to kill a man, or when a mother chains her daughter to her bed so that the teenage daughter cannot feed her drug addiction, as we saw repeatedly in our own fieldwork, we see that residents respond to violence not only through routinized behavior, meant to instill order among some sort of chaos, but also through direct teaching and use of violence. I think that both routine and non-routine practices, including those that involve the deployment of violence, can and should be understood as was Vinaras a long time ago called ordinary ethics. and ethical here understood as a sense of duty, as a sense of a sort of moral striving, as a small discipline that ordinary people perform as a natural expression of their own ethics. Now, so if you've been following, so much so that if violence is indeed concatenated, so are forms of protection that exist in the same sort of continuum of care. So when caring practices end up reproducing other forms of violence, such as when parents, for example, use harsh physical force to discipline their children, or when neighbors physically punish adolescents to, quote unquote, as I heard many, many times, teach them a lesson. What does this mean? I think, and I'm concluding with this, I think that these acts of using violence to prevent violence should be understood and explained with an eye towards the challenges that people at urban margins, parents and especially mothers, face in trying to keep their children safe. The same children that are, drawing those drawings. Under extremely precarious conditions, and in a context in which, to paraphrase a book that I came to read very, very late, and I then realized it was a classic, Jonathan Shea's A Killing Scene in Vietnam, in which the state is actually betraying what is right. And in the state that the state is being complicit with many a perpetrator of violence. I think that even if we use the term inspired by the same concept of the gray zone, I think there is a potential there of actually highlighting the gray zone of state power when the state is actually in sort of clandestine relations with the perpetrators of violence, and I think there's sort of fertile ground to study where the violence is coming from. Thank you.
It's a super pleasure and honor to be here. I really, really miss Berkeley. I was here for, I guess, 10 years as a colleague in the anthropology department on the UCSF side, and I very stupidly left and went to the horrible East Coast and was absolutely miserable there. The weather really, really sucks there. It's much nicer, though, in terms of as an urban space, because the urban spaces suck in California. It's all suburban, car destroyed, socially autistic type of stuff. But you have real cities. You have industrial, or post-industrial cities, where here you just have strip malls. But the weather's so nice and it's wonderful. And I want to also really thank Javier and for giving us, Nancy and I, the honor of being on the cover when we don't deserve to be on the cover. Because Javier, everyone that's edited volumes knows that it's sheer agony to do a volume. You're like angry with all your colleagues by the end of it because no one's ever on time with anything. And nothing ever works, and people don't even name their files correctly, and they lose them, and they can't possibly send their bio sketches or anything. Javier did 1,000% of all that work, and also charismatically organized the conference and selected the people that came, and then pretended that Nancy and I had some kind of influence on the volume. So my real contribution to the volume was partying at Javier's parties at the conference, which was really fun too. It was part of it, and contributing a co-authored article on my current field work that I've just finished in North Philadelphia, and then at the last minute he pulled a quick one and said that Nancy and I had to write postscripts, which means that you have to read everything super carefully and try to figure out what it says. So I want to link the article that I wrote with my co-authors with the postscript organizing around the concept of primitive accumulation and the narcotics trades, the narcotic industry's relationship to the violence, the intimate violence that Javier was talking about, that links the Americas in a truly globalized way, in a very unique way. Latin America is the most violent part of the world. It's rather extraordinary, and I have like one of those, let's see if I can just find it. The slides that show it on a map. You'll have other parts of the world that are temporarily more violent because they have wars going on. But as a place of peace, when it's at peace, Latin America has levels of violence that aren't consistent across Latin America. There are peaceful countries in Latin America, but as a region, it's extraordinarily violent. And I do have a slide for that, but my flight there was a storm in Dallas, and I was up all night on the they didn't give us hotels, so we slept on the ground, and it was freezing cold. So I didn't organize the slides, and then I was scared I can't just show them because we're
So where do you
filming,
wanna
and I
go?
was scared someone would kill me. Don't show the pictures, you're not supposed to.
No, because
That's the problem. So it's okay, I can do it. Thanks, Nancy.
Now you understand what I did.
So, sorry about that.
and we get really angry.
And then they get angry at me.
The guy from Apple was introducing Martha Nussbaum. I could go get
Yeah, no, it's not. Well, it's too hard to find it. I'm sorry, but okay. So anyhow, the volume that we worked on is looking at the end point of this extraordinary global narcotics industry, and I want to. It's looking at the hyper profitable sales point, where a huge proportion of the differential profits come into being. And what's extraordinary, and this is in the inner city of the United States, and specifically the Puerto Rican inner cities of the northeast coast, which are all supplied by none of the narcotics that comes into the East Coast comes from Afghanistan and so forth. It's all coming from Colombia and Mexico primarily, but and also all the other countries that are acting as transshipment points and now production, growing points as well. And so I want to talk specifically about Puerto Rico's colonial relationship to the United States. It's actually a really existing colonialism, none of this post-colonialism bullshit. This is absolute, really existing colonialism. It's official colonialism. The United Nations recognizes it, and it even has the name. It's a free associated territory. It makes no sense. Puerto Ricans aren't allowed to vote for president, but they got drafted when we used to have a draft into the army. It's a really extraordinary phenomenon. They're not even allowed to declare bankruptcy, so now they're being they actually have some social democratic structures that they've managed to carve out in a pact with the devil in the United States that actually does redistribute some income in Puerto Rico, and that is now systematically being destroyed because they're not allowed to declare bankruptcy. And so they're doing what they're doing to Greece to Puerto Rico. It's the same situation. It's rather extraordinary and tragic. And there's nothing Puerto Rico can do about it. And worse yet, Puerto Rico has to want to remain part of the United States because it would be poorer if it wasn't. So the worst insult is that, is what Joan Robinson said. It's worse not to be exploited by capitalism than to be exploited by capitalism. But going back then to this phenomenon of this extraordinary global narcotics industry, it's one of the only industry that systematically reverses the flow of primitive accumulation and capital flows between the North and the South. It's one of the only ones that actually disproportionately grabs dollars from the North and throws them into the South. And I think that's what has emerged in the past 30, 40 years as one of these extraordinary historical material forces within globalization. And it's a globalization on steroids, of course, that finance capital is obviously driving with digital technology and underpriced energy and oil prices and so forth that make possible the common sense of a massive globalization that's so rapid. And so that's, I think, on some level, what reading carefully all the papers, which weren't necessarily reflecting on this relationship between narcotics and the types of violence that we had, but every single one is a genuinely ethnographic paper, and they're completely set in the narcotics environments, 100% of them. And it's actually mind-boggling to see that the organization of social inequality and poverty across the Americas through this global narcotics industry that's actually dragging capital out of the North to the South. It's the only thing that's really subsidizing and creating possibilities for very minimal symbolic upward mobility among the very, very, very poor in Latin America. And versions of the American dream writ large. That make it so appealing and impossible for youth growing up in neighborhoods that are the neighborhoods where we did our ethnographies not to be, or not for a large proportion of the youth, not to be seduced by the narcotics economy and in all its spillover into the different types of control for territory and gangs and stuff like that emerge out of these marginalized urban territories and small town territories, like in the case of Mexico, that become so valuable for the flow of this global narcotics trade. So in the case of the Puerto Rican inner city, where we were doing field work for 5 years, this happens to be the place that, according to the DEA, has it looks like this, and you can see why it's such a good place for selling drugs. That has the purest and cheapest heroin, and according to the DEA. Now I can't. I won't even try to show the slides. I'm sorry. Well, I can't get them to because Macs are horrible. You can't get it to just come up the way you want with like a key, because you're supposed to click on things with a Mac. On a PC, you can do everything with keystrokes. But so forget it. I don't want to do that. Sorry, I apologize. So this. So basically on this block, we at the height of it, we calculated that $42,000 worth of cash was coming in every day. They were selling each bundle is $140, 14 packets of $10 heroin. I had a picture of the $10 heroin. It has a stamp on it. It was called Toyota because they're part of the global label economy and so forth. And they were selling, so they were selling whatever it is, 300 times, whatever, it's 300 bundles. Each bundle is 140 packets. And this is in a neighborhood that's a complete wasteland. This was the old factory neighborhood of Philadelphia that where there's no jobs, there's hardly even corner stores in this neighborhood. And people are actually hungry, and so the kids growing up and there's extraordinary levels of violence, of course, in this neighborhood, but actually quite a bit less than you would expect for that much cash, which has no protection for the state. There's no way to enforce contracts, enforce payment, have anyone not step up and put a machine gun to the person that's holding all those amounts of cash that have to be transferred each day in this extraordinarily poor neighborhood. So it's actually remarkably little violence compared to what would be happening in corporate boardrooms if you didn't have a legal system allowing contracts to get recognized and enforced and organized. And what we found is that the violence was organized what we decided to call a moral economy of violence that was legitimizing the violence to the participants in it. That was that had two contradictory effects. On the one hand, what it was that people were making exchanges of violence to each other, of reciprocal violence, defending their loved ones and their friends and people that they wanted to build alliances with, by violently protecting them for any possible reason whatsoever. Because people were really good at doing violence. They didn't have any money to give each other in exchanges, but they could generously give violence to one another as a support. So people it was very upsetting. We were there and we couldn't figure out why there was all this what ostensibly appeared as completely senseless violence. I'll read from, it's sort of a fieldwork note, but it's not really a fieldwork note. Within a 2-month period during our first spring here, there were 15 shootings, 3 of them fatal within 4 blocks of our apartment. There were also 3 stabbings and 11 aggravated assaults. The following spring was just as violent and just as spectacular, including a prolonged afternoon fusillade a few blocks away from us that left 1 man with 15 bullet wounds. Our last month was just as violently unnerving when a young 20-year-old heroin addict was stabbed to death 15 times by friends of ours for selling selling the fake versions of the brand name of heroin that gets sold on our block to the primarily white addicts that are coming in with most of the money in the case of the contemporary sort of addiction epidemic in the United States right now, which has a disproportionate number of young whites actually who used to be on opioid pills, actually brought into heroin through the pharmaceutical industry, through OxyContin and Vicodin and codeine addictions, and then switching to powder heroin because it's cheaper and easier to get and stabler as a supply than fickle doctors who are schizophrenically sometimes giving you huge prescriptions totally corruptly, and then other times, righteously yanking it out and leaving you totally sick. So basically, so people were establishing networks of support and avenues for upward mobility in this economy that has no other way of regulating itself except through violence, except through legitimate violence in some sense. And everything was super, super organized. There was a bichote. It's a wonderful Puerto Rican colonial slang word for big shot, and it also means big phallus. And it's a super beautiful, ironic word, right, for big shot, bichote. And it comes from that colonial relationship when they stole the land from Puerto Rico and put in plantations and made everyone become a plantation worker from a semi-subsistence farm. So there would be a bichote organizing everything. Anyone could have killed him at any time, but people really liked him. He'd throw great parties, and he would also do shootouts that were super, super spectacular, terrifying all of us at times. And then then he would also beat people up when they were overly violent, or kill people when they mugged customers and things like that. So it actually controlled violence on another level. The other thing, and this was the co-authors were Laurie Hart, George Carandinos, and Fernando Montero. And Laurie Hart was the one that figured this out. This it was super, super distressing to see the kin level violence. What Javier was calling the domestic violence that gets separated out as if it's somehow different from all this other violence. What was amazing to see is that people were doing levels of violence to protect the reputation of. It was often, it's going to be kin scripted and gender scripted. So it's along hierarchies of, shooting someone, beating someone up when they insult your sister or insult your mother, if you're male, and yet it's also super inflected that men aren't supposed to publicly in public beat women. So women are often fighting women that their brothers are asking them to fight for them, and so forth. So there's all kinds of these exchanges of kinship violence. And what we realized is, in the normal kinship environment, you enter into these reciprocal, you enter into these relationships of exchange that were talked about by the old structural functionalists in actually interesting ways when you look at it closely, where you can have these these long-term unrequited debts. But when you're addicted and there's absolutely no economy, you can't participate in that normal exchange of sets of resources, especially along patriarchal lines, with it organized around men supporting their extended households and so forth. But what you can do, this is it, I'm going to end with this. What you can do is beat anyone up for your addicted mother when she gets insulted, even if inside the house you're also fighting with your mother because she's stealing money from your purse or your drawer, and so we would see this way of expressing love through and men would complain about this when they had a lot of sisters. They would say, it's really bad for me because I have 6 sisters, so I'd be fighting a lot. Because they'd be calling on me for, because the women are constantly being, are not constantly, are often insulted, and one has to defend them in this structure of organizing exchanges of kin-based violence around gender and kinship scripts. So, basically, I'm going to stop with that, with just saying I didn't get to the crux of it, that we analyzed this form of primitive accumulation through the narcotics economy. It's kind of interesting. Addiction economy, just in a super nutshell, addiction economies are inelastic, right? Your demand for heroin doesn't change. So you're physically addicted. No matter what the price is, you have to pay for it. So as a result, there's this excessive profit levels. You have the state then that makes it illegal, so you have this other non-market force that also makes it ridiculously profitable. Drugs would be cheap if they weren't illegal, right? So you just wouldn't have them on every other corner in the inner city if there wasn't this profit that could be made off of them. And then you have everyone getting thrown into prison, right, with carceralization. So most of the money at the local level is actually being siphoned into lawyers and then into the carceral system. And the law enforcement system. These are the only unionized places still with pensions and stuff like that for high school, for people without college degrees. It's like this extraordinary transfer of money to another, sort of a parasitical interest group across ethnic lines. The guards are mostly white, and police officers are mostly white, and so forth. So you have those levels, and then you have the prison contractors and so forth, and then of course you have the southward flow of dollars taking it southward into cartel hands. And it goes on actually, because the other alternative is to be declared crazy through SSI. It's the only. I'm going to stop right there. I won't give you that part of the argument. But it's really interesting because SSI is all you can get, but you have to be declared crazy. So then psychiatrists mediate all this, mobilize a huge amount of taxpayers' resources. It requires the destruction of people. So it's like primitive accumulation. Just the way that narcotics people kill their market. It requires killing the person with addiction to make money off it.
Okay. So, I want to have time for us to have a response, and I want to open by saying what a pleasure it is to be with my two compañeros, and for reasons maybe that you won't want me to say. But one is that both Javier and Philippe have watched my back in two horrible places. Javier came to Montes de Oca mental colony for 2 days, a place that I published one article and have a book forthcoming, was in fact a secret project of the dirty war against the mentally disabled peoples. And Philippe I got a call in his crack house in Philadelphia one day, and he and which of your students was it?
I don't remember this.
You don't remember? And woke you up. By the way, Philippe didn't sleep all night. His plane got derailed, and he came
That's
here.
right.
Right. So I said, I'm meeting a very, very dangerous broker in the Philadelphia train station, and I'm terrified to meet him. He could shoot me. I need you to watch my back. And Philippe came and watched my back. Now, I never went to the crack house, and I never went to your community. And also, that Javier and I had a wonderful time in Bogota together at a conference. And we were given one day after our lectures to go to our favorite sites. And Javier went to a barrio that was outside of Buenos Aires, and we're hanging onto rocks and cliffs to kind of get up there, where all the displaced people from Medellin were living. And there were all these problems with who was who was, a vigilante and who was a victim and so forth. And I went to the morgue and had a wonderful day in the Buenos Aires morgue trying to find out about who were the people that came in there. So this was the conference that we were at. It was magnificent. And because I have a little bit of time, I thought I have a long paper here, but I won't. But I will say one thing. We talked a lot so far about the pathologies of everyday life. But I want to link those to the state very, very definitively, because the state seems to be very abstract and not present. And I want to show you that the state, at least in my work in Brazil, I should mention that when I was at the conference, the talk that I smuggled in was not the one that I was supposed to give, and I spoke about the house gun in the United States. and its pathological role. And I think it made everybody a little uncomfortable in Texas and bears it out that that house gun is going to kill us all. So anyway, I want to talk about the responsibility also, because it's one of the themes that came up, theory in action. How do you put theory in action? And so I quote Bourdieu here, the main question that has to be raised for all of us is, must intellectuals, more precisely research scholars and anthropologists, social scientists, intervene in the political world? If so, under what conditions can they do it and do it efficiently? So I want to talk about what Agamben calls zones of indistinction. That is, the recycling of peacetime crimes and wartime crimes. Because Agamben says that we all know that biopolitics is the politics of modernity. And totalitarian biopolitics is not really all that different. Because democracies also produce bare life, also produce, they're controlling it in different ways. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. So my contribution was on death squads and vigilante politics in the one site, and I've been at many sites, but the site that has really possessed me for 50 years. 50 years ago, this June, I began my first work on the Alto do Cruzeiro. And I've seen it go through so many transitions that I want to suggest that longitudinal research in ethnography is probably the most important thing we can do. Even though I've spent the last 20 years going all around the world following kidneys, like the hedgehog, I know one thing, but I know it in a lot of different places. Rather than being in one place, an old plantation town, 150 years old, right smack in the Zona da Mata, which used to be a jungle, essentially, and was turned into a wasteland by sugarcane for hundreds of years. I've been there long enough that there's no sugarcane left. I was there for 2 years during the military dictatorship, and I saw what that could do to people. Mainly, it produced, unlike Argentina, although people disappeared, I was put for 6 months under house arrest. I couldn't go back to Brazil for 15 years until the Abertura, but basically killed through structural violence. So when I began to work the archives in Timbaúba, there were 300 to 400 infants dying in the first month. Child mortality is different, much lower. They were dying in that first month and year of life, and that was quite intentional on the part of the state. So those of you who know my book, Death Without Weeping, I'm going to talk about some of the same people in there as of 2015. I've gone back consistently over these years, from after the 16-year lapse, then going back in 1982, and I go back now just about every year. So infant mortality, nobody was trusted to survive. I talked about the economy of letting go as a moral economy. And I'm sorry I gave this talk in Portuguese last summer, and so I didn't have time to change. In Timbaúba, the place that I work. That is letting go those who could not be predicted to survive, those who couldn't stand on their feet, who couldn't walk, who couldn't speak. It was better that they return to the sky. And I refer to them in my later writings as the Mussulman of the Alto Cruzeiro, and that Alto Cruzeiro was created by the military as a kind of a camp, to use Agamben again, a death camp. So some of my key informants. This was 1982. She was a mother, actually I checked, 15 pregnancies, but only 6 survived. I'm going to talk about the role of death squads, not so much during the military. They were there, but they were invisible. They became very visible under democracy. And so just to say that I was frequently misunderstood, what I was saying about Death Without Weeping, Morte Sem Chorar, the moral economy of letting go was grounded in stoicism, in fortitude, and in strength. But death without weeping did not mean death without suffering. And the women that I worked with, now 4 generations of women, suffered. So I'm going to talk about some of them today. What happened to them, what happened to their children during the period of vigilantism. And I'm also going to tell you who did it. I didn't know for years who did it. In my book, Death Without Weeping, in chapter 6, it's a muddled, oblique chapter. Bodies, death, silences. Something was happening, and this was after the democratic transition. What was happening? Why were people disappearing? Why were their bodies ending up in sugarcane, bloodied, mutilated? Was it a gang? Who was it? Nobody would talk. They only spoke. Nada. A lei de silencio. Ninguém vai falar. Nada. So, here's Adilson, who is, I'll tell you a little bit where it is. He, when he was 2 years old, Teresa believed that Adilson was hopeless. He had to be let go of. Look at him, he was 2 years old. He was famished. He didn't like to eat. When he was 7, I caught her telling him, we're letting him go now. And he says, it's okay, Mike. It's okay. When I said, don't talk to your child like that. Don't tell him he's going to die. He actually had a heart defect, a very bad one, and he never grew. He was stunted. And he said, don't worry. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go there. I'm ready to die. So, well, I started to get to know children as well as their mothers. And like Javier, I used a lot of drawings. And I invited street kids. Street kids in Timbauba were at risk. Okay, some were in jail, some were on the streets, but there was a beginning of a limpeza. And they were in reform school, they were let out of reform school. I wanted to see what they would draw. Here's one of the children that I'll say a little bit about. He says, I'm small Tia, they called me Auntie, but I know a lot of things. Before I ran away from home, I suffered a lot. My mother opened up a cabaret doing sex things. It made me hate all women. You could say, now this kid is 11 years old, but he's very small. He says, you could say I'm a homosexual. I mean, these are kids that are miniature adults, basically. He said, but I became the dona de casa. I became the mother in the household. I took care of everything. When one of the babies got sick, I took them to the clinic. When they died, I went and got their coffin, the free coffin that the mayor gave out. Even the flowers I arranged. He was executed by a death squad in 1999 that was run by a pistolero, a hired gun, a mate gente, called Alberto Guerois, and his guardian angels. But while this was beginning to heat up, these are the pictures. I just said, draw pictures of yourself. Draw pictures of yourself. No American kid living on the street would draw beautiful pictures like these. Everybody is happy. These were all different kids. What's that about, I would ask? What's happening here? Well, it's a big house for a kid living in a favela. Oh, we're stealing electricity, he says. But we have a garden there. Oh, now what's going on here, Louise? Louise, and some of these kids were 12, but they didn't really know how to draw because they hadn't been to school. Oh, he's got his little beggar's pack. And he says, we're getting ready for Carnival, and we're dancing. And so is the sugarcane dancing, the samba. So you had the dancing sugarcane. And also always saying, very polite, begging, there they are, but always saying, may God bless you, God will reward you in their pictures. But my favorite one was this. Oh, Marcel, here. What's going on here? Looks like Jesus is falling off the cross. The Alto Cruzeiro has a giant crucifix with the Jesus on it. What's happening there? What's happening? Well, that's the soldiers. The soldiers are whipping him. And so what's with Jesus? Man, he's running away. He's getting off that cross. So this enormous sense of vitality, whatever. And these are the kids in my cohort. And I'll tell you, none of them are lived. None of these kids, none of those people who wrote those drawings over the years, they all got wiped out. An entire cohort in Timbauba of street kids got wiped out. So, how do I interpret it? Many ways. Sometimes I talk about the shock of democracy. After 20 years of military dictatorship, people get militarized. They get used to it. And when Brazil began producing all these beautiful documents, the new constitution, the Bill of Rights, the rights of children, the rights of workers, the rights of squatters, the rights of women, the rights of pregnant women, the rights of whatever it is, people got scared. And they said, there's no order. There's anarchy. Why are these children all in the street? Under the military, they were in reform schools. They were in jails. And so they decided to produce their own solution. Street kids were, this was a photographer that I worked with who took this picture in Recife, not in Timbaúba. They were feared and they were hated. This is Timbaúba. This sniffing glue. And this is Irene's, one of her two sons that was killed. Okay, now I'll just say what happened. Well, I'll just say this. 2001 was one of the most difficult moments in my career as an anthropologist. I walked into Kroeber Hall and the fax, pa-boom, 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 and whoever was there said, Nancy, you got a really long fax in a language I don't know. I said, oh, it's in Portuguese, great. So, it was a fax from this man. Dr. Humberto Graça, this picture was taken this last summer, was brought in from Recife to prosecute originally 11, and it turned out to be, in the end, about 30 members of the local death squad in Timbaúba. He said, would you come and help us? We need to identify how many bodies they actually killed, where they buried them, and how they killed them. And you can imagine that this fax, the other thing was, the fax said they sent a charge sheet of 12 pages. And it was based on chapter 6 of Death Without Weeping. And that became, even though I could name nothing, I could only talk about the culture of fear, the law of silence, the fact how these things happened, that people wore masks, whatever, that people suspected they might be police. They didn't know exactly who they were. So it caused some consternation in my household, but I agreed to come. And my gentle social worker husband initially said, he's a pacifist, I'll be your bodyguard. I said, Betty, you should help me in the archives. How could I refuse? Boy, did I want to refuse that request without betraying my own words. This was from my militant anthropology article. What makes anthropology exempt from the responsibility to take a politically engaged stance on the events we're privileged to witness? We should be held accountable for what we see and for what we fail to see. Our craft demands long-term commitment, intimacy, intense, focused engagement, solidarity, empathy, and conviviality with our research subjects. Finally, that ethnography is not just a tool of the Enlightenment, but it's also a tool for human liberation, including the liberation of ourselves. So, on my return to the Alto Cruzeiro, I used the same methods I always use as an anthropologist. I walked up and down the Alto. I talked to my friends. I talked to the grave diggers. I went to the hospitals. I went to the Cartório Civil, where I got all of the death reports and the burial informations as to where. Now the amazing thing is, as Claude Snow told me, most of what goes on is there. It's in the records. So I found in the records all the information about people who were thrown under buses, who were stabbed in cane fields. And they said, they're buried in the municipal cemetery, and some of them were buried in what they called clandestine graves. And I thought, I've got to call on the Argentine forensic people. Where are these clandestine graves? They were in Protestant churchyards. That was clandestine because by law in Brazil, you have to have a state burial in a municipal yard. You're not supposed to be buried in a Protestant church. So it was not hard. So there I am, and I find, can you see it? You can't. One of the missing children of Biu, my dearest informant. Her son, Gilvan, was killed on November 18th, 2000. But Biu, this is the complicity, the way in which people get tied up. Biu said her son, Gilvan, was no angel, and that he was hated by the people in the Alto. You know, he was a thief. He was a bruiser, she said. It's the people's justice. But I said to her, but Siobhan never had a trial. He was simply assassinated. Here's the gray zone that Javier began to talk about. The people of the Alto accepted the death squads as necessary, even when their own sons were killed. How so? Is it false consciousness? That's out of favor. Misrecognition, Bourdieu, self-preservation, inevitability, fortitude, stoicism, trying to maybe change the rule a little bit. You can kill my son, but don't mutilate him, as one woman said. It was a moral economy of a master-slave, patron-client relationship that had created terror and dependency. We've talked about addiction. Dependency in a system of paternalismo is a drug. It's a very hard drug to get out of. Edilson, the little baby that was in Terezinha's hands there, he had an absurd entrance into crime in 2004. He was mentally impaired. He had this heart problem. He was stunted. He was little. He got a nickname, Bicudo. Bicudo turns out to be a little kind of barracuda fish that lives in fresh water. That's completely aggressive, will die to the finish. And he has a little pinched-in nose like a barracuda. So that's what he looked like. His first crime, when he was about 15, was that he picked up in the garbage that was dumped at the bottom of the Alto Cruzeiro a broken revolver. It was totally broken. It couldn't work. It had no bullets. It had no bullets. And he put masking tape around it, and he just stuck it in the face of a young girl that he knew in his part of the Alto. She just came with one of those little, cloth bags, the web kind, that had her little groceries in it. And so he ended up in jail for physical assault with a weapon that wasn't a weapon. And what he had stolen was little packs of chewing gum, a hair comb, a pair of rosary beads, and a couple of bananas. That's what he stole. And that was the beginning of his life. So today, he now is in a correctional facility in 2014 in Caruaru. And here's Terezinha in grief about, and I was kind of shocked at the same time. Lourdes, my other key informant, if you've read Death Without Weeping, had her given up baby, was one of the first to be shot and was found on the bottom of the Alto Cruzeiro. And here we are talking about it. Evidence-based ethnography, with the help of a group of local human rights workers in Timbaúba, none of whom are educated, all of whom were organic intellectuals. I was able to confirm that over 100 street kids and unemployed, it was racialized black men, were murdered by Abderel Carois and his extermination group. This extermination group was hired by the mayor. His name is Gilson. Gilson is hiding out in Miami. Okay, I have to wind up. There's a tipping point, and we did protest. Irene protested the death, and all of the women who lost people to the death squads. We had a public, it was on national TV. We worried that the police were maybe not on our side. This is Sophia, she's reading in front of the mayor's office from Death Without Weeping. Okay, I'm back with the woman known as Black Irene, whose picture was there earlier, who lost her husband and two of her sons. Philippe will recognize this picture. This is when you went to the Alto Cruzeiro, you met him, and he's still there helping his mom out. I'm going to show you the last picture. I'm going to say there's the good, the bad, the beautiful, and the ugly. And one of the contradictions is that during the same time of the death squads, there was also a revolution in terms of reproduction. And I've written articles on it. No more angel babies. Women are healthy. The children are healthy. They're breastfeeding their children. There's no doctors. Women give birth at home. 60,000 people in the municipio, not one public resident doctor. The only doctor today, a Cuban doctor. who actually brought the Spanish edition of my book with him. Another homicide on the Alto Cruzeiro in 2014, the day before I left. But the leaders of the death squad are still in prison. What's going on? There's been a decline. Here's what I could be shot by. This man, Marinaldo Rosendo, is the richest man in Pernambuco. He was twice elected mayor of Timbaúba. He is now a federal deputy, not a senator, but in the House of Representatives in Brasilia. He owns most of downtown Timbaúba. He is a billionaire. He owns the largest beer company now, Sheen. And he has bought up almost all the land in Timbaúba. He was accused of financial and voter fraud, having been a financial backer of the vigilante death squad headed by Abdiel Queiroz and his gang. He has a middle school education. He travels in an armed vehicle with bodyguards, as well he might. He has not opened his mouth once in the Brazilian Congress. He just gives his Mona Lisa smile. And this information about him not only came from public documents, I spent a lot of time with him when he was campaigning last summer, but from the prosecutor who met me in Timbaúba to explain what was going on. So this is the end. This is the group of some of the activists that I work with, and the work continues. So I guess the answer is to this is that you want to maintain your optimism. You know, you want to have happy endings, but one has to be a realist. And there are no happy endings. There are just the continuations of struggles and fights. And so I hope maybe to be, you know, our work should still be based in a kind of an optimism, but with a pragmatic understanding that there's no simple answer except what the prosecutor, I'll just read his one last thing to me, and then I will sit down if I have it here. What he says here is in this very long interview that he insisted that I take and record. He said, the fact is that Timbaúba has a long history of violence, mainly in the social realm, such as it is in its entrenched poverty, drug-related crimes, a lack of infrastructure and basic resources. The Aurelio brothers, a death squad who we identified, existed before Abdiel Queiroz. And that's why the Municipio hired him to wipe out the other death squad. And so his defense, when Abdiel Queiroz and his band, were in the court, he said, how could I be a death squad? I was on the town council. I would go to the Prefeitura building and get my money every week. And so Graça didn't know quite what to say, because public, private, public violence, structural violence, symbolic violence are all there together. And what he asked for in the end is he said, Nancy, I can't go back to Timbaúba. You're living in Recife. My life would be ruined. And they ruined the life of all of those people that you worked with. I'm safe because I go back home. But he said the only answer is a total revolution. And I'll leave that for us to think about.